Welcome to Music Maps, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. So we've never done a deep dive on this topic until now. David Browne joins us today, all the way from New York. He's got his fantastic book about Crosby, Stills and Nash. It's been out a few years, but you can still read it. It's a big chunky book, so it's a big story, this. So I think what we're going to do here, we're going to just focus on the beginning, the formation of the band, how they leave their previous bands and how they all come together here. David has written for Rolling Stone. Welcome to David. Thank you for joining us all the way from the US.
Thanks, Simon. It's great to be here. And I'm honored to be the person to help you, to guide you through this particular saga for the first time on your show.
Yeah, it's quite a messy story, this, really, isn't it, in the end? I remember when I first discovered them, I had this book and it had all the solo projects listed, and I was cross-referencing them, being like, so when they were making their first record, they also had, and then when they were making their second record, they had, and I was kind of bewildered by just how much was in there. Let's start February of '68 at the Whiskey A Go-Go, Sunset Strip in LA. Is this the first time that the members of what becomes Crosby, Stills and Nash are actually together?
It would appear to be. I mean, it's a little, parts of their story are remain foggy, even like the first time they sang together. But certainly that show, that Hollies show, was the first time I think that Crosby and Stills, who had already been hanging around together and were circling around each other and thinking of forming a band together, saw Nash perform live with the Hollies and had the first impression of how he could fit in with them. The first time the three of them supposedly sang together was a few months later. It was either in Joni Mitchell's house or Mama Cass's house. But when I interviewed Alan Clark, who was Graham Nash's bandmate in the Hollies at the time, he remembers Crosby and Stills going back to the hotel where the Hollies were staying that night after that show, and the three of them singing there for the first time together. So, who knows? But it was absolutely an important night in their story, for sure. And it really, I think Crosby and Stills were not just thinking of forming a band, but wondering what else they might need. Another harmony singer or something else to flesh out their sound, and seeing Nash sing with the Hollies really put that thought into their mind that, maybe this could be one of those people.
So let's begin with David Crosby. So what led to him leaving the Byrds? I think about 4 months prior to this meeting at the Whiskey.
Crosby was, bless him in his way.
Quite a vocal character, David Crosby.
A vocal character, very much a kind of a contrarian sort of guy, very much someone who had his own firm, beliefs about music and lifestyle. And he was already clashing with the members of the Byrds by then. Crosby was really the hippie in the Byrds, frankly. Compared to Chris Hillman and Roger McGuinn, he was the one who, was most outspoken about politics and drugs. And he was writing songs at that point like Triad, which is about having a menage a trois, with two other women. You think back at that, at the time, it doesn't seem that unusual for the time for rock and roll in the mid-'60s. But in the context of the Byrds, those kinds of songs and those kinds of, public pronouncements didn't go over all that well with the other guys. So there was already a kind of a growing friction within the band. And Crosby was very outspoken about things like the JFK assassination. And, when he went on stage with the Byrds at the Monterey Pop Festival in the summer of '67, he went off on a whole kind of, rant about the Warren Commission and who killed Kennedy, and the other Byrds were so embarrassed. And in the same weekend, he sat in with the Buffalo Springfield, kind of filling in sort of for Neil Young, who had temporarily left. And that didn't go over too well with the other guys in the Byrds. One of the interesting things, just to skip ahead for a second, about Crosby, Stills, Nash Young that was so revolutionary and was very much in the air by 1969, 1970 was the idea of the rock group as a set formation was considered passé. at the moment. Like you shouldn't be confined to one band and one lineup. You should have multiple partners. And if you want to jam with this person or sit in with that person, that's okay. But in 1967, that really wasn't considered cool to do. If you were in one band, you stuck with your one band. And so that's how the other guys in the Byrds felt. And so between that and the kind of material Crosby was writing, his irritation that they wanted to record another Bob Dylan cover of My Back Pages for their Younger Than Yesterday album, there was just a lot of tension building in the group, and led to him being fired not long after Monterey Pop.
Yeah, so Crosby finds himself at a loose end. I think Stephen Stills is still nominally a member of Buffalo Springfield, but were they kind of drawing to a natural end around the same point?
They were as well. One of the things that is so fascinating to me, and especially when I was doing this book, is how quickly things came together and fell apart back then. In the case of the Springfield, they were already starting to fall apart, in that fall of 1967, which was like a year and a half after they started. We think of these bands as these, landmark important institutions, which they were, but how quickly they came together and started collapsing. And so, yes, the Springfield was in a state of flux by that point. I mean, the reason David Crosby sat in with them at Monterey Pop in the summer of 67 was that Neil Young bailed at the last minute. And Neil was having all kinds of conflicted feelings about fame and stardom and the group, and their bass player, his friend Bruce Palmer, had left, and so there was a lot of angst going around, a lot, very much hinting at how it would be like to deal with Neil for those other guys in the future. Of course, he was sort of in and out of things, and so it was kind of an amazing confluence when you think about it. The Crosby being kicked out of the Byrds, the Buffalo Springfield, in the middle of disintegrating, Crosby and Stills each finding themselves kind of at loose ends, not feeling confident enough in each other to start solo careers, which is really an interesting thing to think about. You'd think that they would have, but they each liked the idea of being in a band, really, and naturally being kind of drawn together in the LA scene in a very kind of organic way.
Graham Nash, still a member of the Hollies at this point, and more so perhaps than Buffalo Springfield. The Hollies were a very successful band. They've had big hits in the UK and also in the US. Did he ultimately feel a bit hemmed in by the scope of the Hollies?
I think he did. Nash, the Hollies had been to Los Angeles already, before Nash left them, and he was introduced to that whole set of Laurel Canyon music scene, the Mamas and the Papas and Crosby. It's when he first met Crosby during a Hollies tour, and he got to smoke weed with all these people, and they had the whole milieu of that world, that it was sort of pop music, but there was a kind of counterculture hip vibe to it, just completely appealed to Nash. He was feeling it already at that point, somewhat restricted by the Hollies. You did see that they were a hugely successful pop band and wanted to keep that going. And Nash was the sort of experimental one in that group. We don't really think of Graham Nash maybe now perhaps as any sort of as avant-garde, but in the Hollies, he was writing these songs like King Midas in reverse, and also a song called Marrakesh Express that the Hollies made a half-hearted attempt at recording with him, never finished it, but they didn't like it, and they were, I think one of the moments when Nash realized that he wasn't right for that band anymore is that they were rejecting his songs like Marrakesh Express, and instead they wanted to record an album of Bob Dylan covers, including a very glitzy kind of Las Vegas-y version of Blowing in the Wind. And he was just, it was hard to imagine anything less cool than that, at that moment. And so on one hand, Nash is feeling underappreciated in the Hollies and feeling as if they're just simply not a cool band to be with anymore. And at the same time, he's meeting all these people in California who know who he is. They love his singing. They welcome him into their world. And he's feeling like, these are my people, not these Brits.
How important was Mama Cass in having this all fall into place?
I think at this point, most people think of Cass Elliot as, the singer in the Mamas and the Papas who tragically died in 1974, but she was such an important player in that scene. She was just a champion of everybody, and she would have these parties at her house and invite people over. Bless you. Invite people over to kind of hang out with and meet. And she was sort of like this sort of socialite sort of music gatherer. And so she would have these, and she was always thinking like, oh, this person would be great with this person. This person would be great with that person. And that was the case here, where she knew Crosby and Stills. And she knew that they were, they had done a little bit of demo recording together, but they didn't really have a formal band. And they kept thinking, oh, it'd be great to have a high harmony singer. Who could that be? And it was Cass Elliot, who supposedly was the one who said, you should check out this Graham Nash guy from the Hollies. I hear he's not that happy, and he's got a great voice. And, that partly led them to go see the Hollies at that whiskey show. So she was a super important person in the coming together of that group, for sure.
So we mentioned at the beginning, the first time they sing together or play together, it's kind of hazy. There's stories seem very contradictory, in fact. When do you think was probably the first vocal jam session, if you like?
It appears to be in the summer of 68, because in the fall, Nash was back in London with the Hollies. He hadn't actually left them yet, and they had some shows to do. So it appears to be in that summer. Where it was exactly, Crosby and Nash, right up through, Crosby's, death, maintained that it was at Joni Mitchell's house. And it was Stills and Nash singing You Don't Have to Cry, and Nash kind of slipping in and joining them in the harmony. Stills has always maintained that it was at Mama Cass's place. And they've actually gotten into arguments with each other, when Crosby was still with us, as the three of them debating in front of interviewers, where it happened. Because, Stills will be like, no, it was at Mama Cass's place. I know it for a fact because he's like his memory was that he had enormous respect for Joni Mitchell as a songwriter, and he would have felt embarrassed singing his songs in front of her, that he couldn't have done that. He would have been too intimidated to sing a Stephen Stills song to Joni Mitchell. Whereas, Mama Cass wasn't really a songwriter. And so in his mind, that's where it happened, at Mama Cass's place, which were two different houses, in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, there's no tape recordings. There don't seem any photographs. Nobody had, iCal on their cell phones, because there weren't cell phones or computers. So, but there was so much hanging out around that time. John Sebastian, who I interviewed for my book, he had left the Lovin' Spoonful. He was living in Los Angeles. He was part of that group, and he remembers all three of them singing around a pool, somewhere. And so it's all a little hazy, but they did agree that they did sing that Stills song together as the first time, and that there was an immediate kind of vocal spark there. They suddenly went, oh, this is what we've been looking for. This person could be a great addition to our group, even though he's still in a group.
Was there any hint that any of them would go down this path? Because it's a pretty different direction to their previous bands, I think, in all cases, in some respects.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Each of these guys, and this, if we were to start with the core trio, they were in so many ways such an unlikely group to come together. Not only that, in terms of their personalities, because each one of them had a very different personality, but also in terms of their singing voices and their musical backgrounds. Crosby as he told me in interviews for the book, basically didn't really grow up with rock and roll, even though he was a teenager when it started. He was more into kind of like jazz and some classical, and he wasn't really like blasting Elvis Presley records in his house. Nash was very much a young rock and roll kind of guy, and Stills was a rock and roll guy, but was very much rooted in kind of folk and blues, and had spent time in Greenwich Village, New York, coffee houses and playing solo acoustic. And so they each were rooted in a style of music very different from the other. And yet I think the first hint of that they could merge into something was when Crosby helped Stills write Rock and Roll Woman for the Buffalo Springfield. The opening kind of lick of that song, if you listen to it now, it's Crosby says he basically wrote it. He didn't get credit for it, and he sang a little bit on the recording. So there was a first hint that like there could be some common ground there. And Nash, something again like King Midas in Reverse or some of his later Hollies songs were not quite like some of the early Holly hits like Bus Stop and Look Through Any Window, all great pop songs. But there were hints of Nash was stretching out himself. And so I think they were all like heading in the similar direction in their own ways.
So once Graham Nash actually leaves the Hollies, I think Crosby, Stills and Nash actually all wind up actually here in London rather than LA to begin with.
They did, with the idea of auditioning for Apple Records, which was still a relatively new label that the Beatles had started. And the Beatles, of course, were famously looking for new signings. And so it kind of, Nash knew the Hollies and the Beatles, knew each other. And so who wouldn't want to be on Apple Records, even though it would soon turn into a bit of a chaotic situation. But, in 1968, the Beatles are still together. They're finishing up the White Album. It's still, Apple Records is launching. They're signing some quality acts. And so it's going to make sense that they would want to go over there and audition for them. And so they did spend some time over there, worked on their repertoire, which they were very serious about. And then that happened in New York, in Long Island, New York City, and Los Angeles. The three of them really kind of bore down on their harmony singing and what songs they were going to, contribute to the group. And part of that process was in London. They knew Peter Asher, who had been Peter and Gordon, and so knew Paul McCartney, and was now one of the people signing acts to Apple Records. They auditioned apparently for him and supposedly George Harrison as well. And they came over into the apartment where Crosby, Stills and Nash were staying, and those guys played live for those guys, and apparently nothing happened from it. Now, again, why that was, Peter Asher couldn't quite remember. George isn't with us anymore. There was some, thought on Crosby, Stills and Nash's part, I think, that maybe the Beatles were a little threatened by this sort of supergroup, that they would have preferred to sign more upcoming acts, not sort of somewhat established people like these guys. It's hard to imagine, George Harrison or Peter Asher hearing those guys sing some of those early Crosby, Stills and Nash songs and thinking, oh, these guys aren't good enough. But in the end, it was probably a good thing that they didn't get signed to Apple. But it was
a good thing for them. I think it was
process.
A bad thing for Apple. It was a good thing for Crosby, Stills and Nash. I think it was probably a bad thing for Apple, because if they'd got a big act like that, I think maybe Badfinger's probably the biggest act that end up releasing on Apple in this era. So yeah,
I think that's probably true. Yeah, other than their own Beatles solo things, I think Badfinger was probably about it. It was probably for the best for the group in particular. Not so great. Not so great for Apple. That could have sold some records. They also rehearsed and woodshedded on Long Island for a while in a house owned by John Sebastian. Then they were back in LA. They did some demo recording in New York. It was a sort of gradual process. What was sort of funny too was one of the first announcements of this group coming together was kind of, I think it was early 1969, in an issue of Billboard magazine, the music industry, trade magazine, were announced that Stills, Crosby, Nash were just signed to Atlantic Records. And I was like, Stills, Crosby, Nash? And that was, I had to ask all of them, like, what was that about? And it's kind of a first sign of, the sort of tussling that would go on in the group, because, Stills wanted his name first, because he was sort of the dominant, really the dominant songwriter and musician in the band at that point. But, Crosby said, no, that wasn't going to happen. And also, Crosby, Stills, and Nash sounds better than Stills, Crosby, Nash.
It sounds a bit to me like one of these multi-team NBA trades that you see today. So how do they ultimately end up signing to Atlantic? Because this is quite a complex thing to make this happen.
Yes, because each of them were on different record companies. Crosby had been with the Byrds on Columbia Records. Nash had been on with the Hollies and Epic Records, which was a sister label of Columbia, and Buffalo Springfield were on Atlantic Records. So it was a question of what label would get them and how they would kind of figure this all out. And essentially, Crosby was no longer with the Byrds, so that wasn't a point anymore. But then it was, how do we get Nash in? And basically, they decided to sign with Atlantic Records. Nash was able to go to Atlantic, but Epic Records, which lost Nash, was for the trade, sort of got to sign Poco, which was the group that had also formed out of Buffalo Springfield with Richie Furay and Jim Messina. So it was sort of a bit of a baseball, like a baseball trading kind of situation.
You'll get these two. You'll get these two guys, and we'll take one player, and we'll swap another one with another team, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
right. And it sounds kind of wacky in retrospect, but Richie Furay was sang lead on a lot of those Buffalo Springfield songs, or as many as Neil and Stills.
So they think they're getting something good out the deal by getting him.
They might have thought, they were playing, country rock, which hadn't quite kicked in commercially as a genre. You listen to early Poco stuff, you can imagine like, oh, maybe some of these songs, like You Better Think Twice or whatever, that could be hit singles. They weren't, but they weren't, a hardcore honky tonk band or something. They were pretty smooth in their way. So you can almost see someone at Atlantic saying, or someone at Epic saying, Poco might be something.
So it's Crosby, Stills, and Nash at this point. It feels like, as we discussed, there's a few egos here. It's going to be a little bit of a complex arrangement within the band. Was it always the plan to self-produce this first album?
It appears to be. And they had Bill Halverson, a recording engineer, helping them out. By that point, they were all pretty confident in their abilities, but also just very, I think, wary of producers they'd worked with in the past before. Stills had always been critical of the first Buffalo Springfield record, which was produced by their managers, who weren't really experienced record producers. He always thought that record sounded really thin. I think Crosby had bristled at some of the Byrds producers who wanted to make them seem a little more commercial. Everything about that project was them sort of breaking the rules a little bit. Whether it was, Stills playing most of the instruments himself, a lot of overdubbing, producing the record themselves, and also the band name. Groups usually back then had group names.
Yeah.
And they purposely chose Crosby, Stills, and Nash, or however it became in the end, because I think they wanted to show they were a group, but also three individuals. I think it was good for each of their reputations to have their names right in the group like that. And it was kind of a statement of, well, there's the three of us, and we're going to make this record. And then maybe it'll be the two of us, or maybe it'll be one of us. And they wanted to keep it sort of loose. And they didn't want, they had all felt a little, Crosby and Nash in particular, a little burned by the fact that they had left or been kicked out of their previous bands and then basically sort of been replaced. And the groups had gone on, the Hollies and the Byrds continued. And I think they each felt a little stung by that in their way. And I think so they didn't want I think their feeling was, if one of us leaves Crosby, Stills and Nash, there won't be the group anymore. And this is a way to guarantee that they're not going to, unless they hired Ed Crosby for Crosby, Stills and Nash, there would be no Crosby, Stills and Nash if one of them left. And I think that was a very important thing for their, I don't know, maybe sense of self-worth, that they just couldn't just be cast aside and a group continue without them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I was so intrigued by when I first came across them. There was Crosby and Nash, there was the Stills Young band, there was Crosby, Stills, Nash, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I already knew Neil Young well, but I didn't realize he'd been in this band, and there was just all these different configurations of the band, all the solo material, and they're playing on each other's records, as was commonplace in this era. You touched on earlier, they relocate out to Long Island and to get away from the presumably many distractions of LA.
Right.
And while there, they meet Dallas Taylor while they are there, who comes in as the drummer for the touring version of the band. How does singer-songwriter Judy Collins come to play a perhaps inadvertent role in this first record?
Yeah, she and Stills ultimately became lovers. They had met when he had played on her album, Who Knows Where the Time Goes. And they were very smitten with each other. And, she was in New York as well. She was based in New York City, still is. And so that whole relationship was going on, although she told me she didn't go out to Long Island much and listen to them rehearse, because they just really wanted to kind of be sequestered in their kind of way. But she ends up in a very kind of passionate relationship with Stills, which ends up crumbling not long afterwards, but does give them lots of great songs.
Yeah.
To come out of it. I mean, she was around when they were recording the Crosby, Stills and Nash record in Los Angeles. But, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes is obviously about them coming together and breaking up, and, You Don't Have to Cry, with its reference to music managers getting in the way and things like that, obviously is kind of an allusion to their relationship as well. So apparently it was a difficult time for them as a couple, but she definitely was inspired a whole bunch of songs on that record.
Yeah, I think Sweet Judy Blue Eyes is probably the tune that I used to certainly play for people who didn't know the band, and I'd be like, have a listen to this. But despite not having played live yet up to this point, they finished this debut album almost themselves, and they have very minimal outside assistance here, don't they? But I wanted to ask you, my favorite track off the debut, Helplessly Hoping. Do you know anything about the writing or making of that particular track?
Helplessly Hoping is a song that predates the group, but it turned into this perfect showcase for them as harmony singers, and the way that the arrangement being very threadbare and acoustic was a statement in itself, that coming after Sgt. Pepper and all these more elaborately produced things, here was a group that was kind of taking it more back to basics. But it was also a great showcase for their harmonies just in the chorus alone. Still sings the first line by himself. Then Nash joins him in a harmony on the second line, and then Crosby comes in on the third line. And it's almost like you hear the blend of those voices, like one line at a time, and in each of the choruses of those songs. And it's really pretty powerful and really, really pretty lovely. And I think a real defining moment, I think, for that group.
The cover photo, where was it taken?
What's really funny about the cover of the first Crosby, Stills, Nash record is that I remember when I bought a copy when I was 13, and you're seeing them sitting on this kind of dilapidated couch in front of this little house. And I always imagined it was somewhere deep in the woods or hills of Laurel Canyon or Topanga Canyon, some funky setting. And, when I was researching my book, I found the exact location, which is now, I don't know, like a strip mall with a drugstore. I mean, the house is long gone. It's right in West Hollywood, right off a major intersection. But at the time, there was a little house there, and the detail was that they decided to take the cover photos, sitting there on this couch, which they came across, and with photographer Henry Diltz, they sat down on the couch. He took a bunch of shots, and they thought great, and they all went home, and Henry Diltz developed the photos a couple days later. It wasn't instantaneous like it is now with cell phones. And they looked and they realized they were out of order, that it was Nash, Stills, and Crosby. And they suddenly realized, oh my God, we can't have that happen. It's going to be completely confusing to have the group name above them and they're not in the right order underneath the names. So they said, all right, we got to go back. So I guess they put back on their same clothes that they had on a couple of days ago, jeans and whatever, and went back, and it turned out the house had been demolished. It was already like a pretty rundown place. And so they had no choice but to go with that photo. It's become an iconic photo. Boy Genius did a parody, sort of a tribute homage album cover to it.
The album's in the can and awaiting release, and it might feel like a strange time to add a fourth member to the band. So whose idea was it to add Neil Young to Crosby, Stills and Nash?
Everyone basically says it was the head of their record company, Ahmet Ertegun. And, when we look back and we think, well, okay, Crosby, Stills and Nash were a new self-contained unit. They were about to release this album. They already had a big buzz around it in LA, and people were already talking about it. And Neil was a solo act. Why would this all come together? It almost seems like it doesn't make sense, but it was actually a perfect solution for everybody. Crosby, Stills, Nash had to tour. They had a drummer, as you mentioned, Dallas Taylor, who's on the back cover of the Crosby, Stills, Nash record. People think that's Neil Young. That was Dallas Taylor. But they needed other musicians. Crosby and Nash were, capable, like rhythm guitar players. They weren't keyboard players. And they needed something to kind of flesh out their sound. They famously reached out to Steve Winwood, who said no, and were trying to figure out the right person. And Ahmet Ertegun, who had signed Buffalo Springfield to Atlantic Records and just was a huge fan of that group and a huge admirer of Stills' particular, and was really heartbroken when Springfield broke up. And he had the idea of like suggesting to them, well, what about Neil? And, Stills once told me, his first reaction was, well, Neil is Neil. He does his own thing. He's kind of a control freak. But it solved two problems. Number one, it gave Crosby, Stills, and Nash an added guitarist/keyboardist who could help, flesh out their sound on stage. And we forget that at that point in time, spring, early summer of 1969, Neil Young was not Neil Young, big solo artist. He had already released his first album early in that year, Neil Young. Great record, The Loner, just some amazing songs on there. But it was not a hit record at all. And he had just completed and released Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere with Crazy Horse, which was also not a hit record right away. So Neil was making some great music on his own, but it wasn't really connecting with the public yet. And so adding him into the group solved their kind of stage issue. And it also was a good move for him. It put his name out there. It was going to put his name out there in the public in a way that his solo albums weren't. He was going to be part of, as you said earlier, a supergroup. What's interesting is that they didn't want his name in the group to begin with. They were releasing an album called Crosby, Stills and Nash, which was kind of a hit record out of the box. And they wanted to tour as Crosby, Stills and Nash with Neil just like on stage in the background. And he was the one who said, no, if I'm in the group.
Understandably so.
You got to put my name in there, and I'm not going to be some side man in the background. And who knows if that also played into his relationship with Stills, and he didn't want to be subordinate to Nash. Was the one who particularly was sort of hesitant. Stills was worried about the control freak ways and Neil being a little unreliable at times back then. And I think, Nash, tells the story about he decided he wanted to meet Neil and sit down and talk to him. And so they did, and they went for breakfast and had a great time. And then he heard some of his songs. Neil played some of his songs, and they realized, oh, okay, well, he can bring something else to this group. But it was an early sign too of Neil very much being his own man within the group, and the fact that he didn't just roll over and say, okay, I'll just be in the background on stage, and you guys are the stars. And he kind of, it was his way of staking his claim already. Like, okay, I'm going to be in this group, but I'll have a pretty big say in it as well, and I want to still stand apart and get something out of this myself, So it was the dynamic was established pretty early there.
I think it probably raises their commercial viability, perhaps. But as you say, the first record's already a hit anyway. But is this also what introduces the volatility which ultimately comes to define them, or was that already in place right from the very beginning?
There was a little bit of volatility there. I mean, you saw it like we were talking about the group name, and Crosby being like, it was not going to be Stills Crosby Nash.
Yeah, exactly.
But there was suddenly going to be a big shift because Stills was very much in control of that first Crosby, Stills and Nash record. He was the guiding musical force. He played most of the instruments on it, and he was the captain of that ship. And he liked it that way. Later on, when he had his own solo bands, they would call him Sarge, Sergeant Stills, because he had a military school background, and he liked to be in charge. And to introduce Neil into that mix would prove to be, on one hand, musically advantageous to everybody, but it really kind of upset that very delicate sort of nitroglycerin chemistry within that group, where everything seemed like it was copacetic with the trio, and you throw in this other guy who has his own way of doing things and is very stubborn and, wasn't necessarily going to let Stills be in charge of everything. And so it would end up, I wouldn't say damaging him in some way. To this day, there are people in their camp who I interviewed for my book who think, why did they add Neil? Why didn't they just hire some keyboard player in the band and just continue as a trio? And it wouldn't have hurt the brand. They didn't use that phrase, the brand, back then. But, when Crosby, Stills and Nash would reunite later as a trio, they would have to endure people yelling out, "Where's Neil?" Whereas if Neil had never been a part of the group, they never would have had to deal with that. And maybe they would have lasted longer as a group. Who knows?
Yeah, I think the one thing that Neil brings is the material. That he consistently has material from here on. Whereas I think with the other three, once it gets a bit deeper into their career, they don't quite have the volume of material that Neil has. Because at this point, late 60s, early 70s, they've all got loads of material and they're knocking out great. If anyone's not heard some of their the first Stills solo album, Crosby, If I Could Only Remember My Name, Graham Nash's early solo records, they're all really, really good. But I think as time goes on, that starts to weaken. So I think what Neil brings is he's always got the material, hasn't he, really? So that's probably one of his main thing there.
He was absolutely the most prodigious of the songwriters in the group. And they really were on such a roll. I mean, you look back when they this is cutting to a year later after they release Deja Vu and they go on tour together. It's so interesting because they were playing all these songs on that tour in that summer of 1970. They were so productive at that point that, they were doing songs like Don't Let It Bring You Down and Ohio and Love the One You're With and Chicago by Nash. These were songs that weren't on records yet. They were just like introducing them and debuting them on that tour. And it was just such a sign of how creative they were at that point, and just maybe in a sort of competitive way, but they were just writing so many songs that they didn't have time to record them yet. They were introducing these songs, so many of the great songs, for the first time on stage. The Southern Man was another one, that wasn't by the time they were doing Southern Man, after the Gold Rush wasn't out yet. And they were hardly doing anything from Deja Vu.
Motown bassist Greg Reeves rounds out the touring lineup, and I think a planned debut gig at New York's Fillmore East is postponed. So where do they actually first play live?
They first played in Chicago. They actually started a tour in the summer of '69 with Neil. And the first show they did was in Chicago, and with Joni Mitchell as the opening act. And she, of course, she had a thing with Crosby, and she was at that point with Graham Nash. And then their famously, their second gig is at Woodstock, which they said on stage, and it was accurate. So, unlike the debates about where they first sang, yes, their second show was at Woodstock. They were all right about that. And again, this was such, the first album had just come out, and there was definitely a lot of talk about them, a lot of anticipation. But again, another example of what was to come, because as we now know, of course, Neil did not want to be filmed. He didn't, he didn't like the idea of cameras in his face. And that's why, anyone who goes to see the Woodstock movie, you'll just see the three of them doing Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. But they did a whole set with Neil singing, playing on most of the rest of it. And that's why, of course, if you listen closely, when they're introduced by the MC, it was probably Chipmunk saying, ladies and gentlemen, Crosby, Stills, Nash. So they even erased and Young from that. It was, again, like a sign that Neil was going to call the shots of his own. He was already kind of flexing his power in the group, even though they were more powerful, quote unquote, commercially speaking, than he was. But he wasn't about to kind of just roll over for them. In fact, one of the songs we most famously associate with them, the four of them back then, of course, was his song Helpless. And, that wasn't even intended for them, for Crosby, Stills, and Nash to begin with. That was meant for him, Crazy Horse. And he tried recording that song with Crazy Horse one day in '69, and it just wasn't coming together. And so when they started working on Deja Vu, he brought it with him that same day, apparently, and got the final version with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. So even in that case, like, he intended Helpless to be for himself. It just was almost a happy accident that it ended up on a CSNY record. And it was, and again, and Woodstock was another sign of him just saying, like, I'm with you guys, but I'm not at the same time.
Did Neil always have one eye on the door, even though he's just joined here, but it feels like he's always looking out for his own interest?
I think so. And, I wouldn't necessarily, hold it against him in a way, because they were a sort of volatile group. And also, when you think about, like you said, they were all started making solo albums soon afterwards. I mean, Deja Vu is basically has, roughly speaking, maybe 2 or 3 songs by each of them. And they're cranking out all these songs at this point. And you think, well, they're not going to want to be confined to just putting out 2 songs a year on a record. And Neil in particular was getting, really productive, as you said. And here he has all these songs. And, so you can kind of understand in a way that he was like, well, I don't want this just to be my only outlet, because I have more than 2 songs a year that I want people to hear. But yeah, he used the group to his advantage. It wouldn't be the first time, but he definitely used it to his advantage to make himself, as much of a household name as rock bands were in 1970.
They're all people who've escaped previous conflicts in other bands. They all come together here. They probably find it potentially even worse in what becomes termed a supergroup. But the kind of extraordinary blend that we talked about there, the vocal blend and the way they all fit together, is kind of extraordinary, really, because it feels like it kind of just all came together almost by accident more than anything, really.
Compared to, say, something, the other supergroup at that time was Blind Faith, and there was with Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, Ginger Baker, Richard. There was a bit more of a business angle to that, a little bit of like, well, Cream had broken up and Traffic, and let's get these guys together and form a supergroup. I think there was something a lot more organic about Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I think in part because, Stills and Crosby in particular weren't household sort of names that people were that record company people thought, well, of course, if we do this, it's going to sell 1 million copies. And most people didn't know even Graham Nash's name. But it wasn't a super calculated proposition to begin with. I mean, I think they were all searching for some kind of life after their previous groups. And they wanted certainly to have a group that highlighted each of them and allowed them to freedom to do other things as well. So if that was probably the calculation in terms of the group name and why they chose that. And they lived up to that by, breaking up and doing their own solo and duo things for many years afterwards. It wasn't a guaranteed blockbuster. And I think it was a kind of a case of three guys who felt kind of cast adrift by their previous groups and trying to figure out where do we go from here, and being more focused, I think, on the music than it was on sort of the commercial potential.
So that's the story of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Maybe we'll record another episode about them down the line because, as I say, it's a really thick topic here. There's so much.
This is just the beginning of
this is just
really
the start.
One of the most incredible sagas. Yeah.
There's rock, so much in there. If any listeners would like to let us know what time period you might like to hear about, maybe the 1974 tour, maybe Deja Vu. I think a lot of UK listeners will. Certainly for me as a kid, Our House, I first heard on the Halifax Bank TV ad. So anyone, I think, who was a child in the 90s.
Yes.
So it was a mortgage ad. So the whole vibe was, we're trying to sell you buying a house. So that was where
another later point of contention in that group. Yes, we can discuss that later.
Maybe you like the Sausages on Sticks album, In Space front cover.
Yes, and the Daylight Again era, which a lot of people certainly love. Southern Cross might not realize David Crosby isn't on that song because he was in such bad shape, and the chaos behind that record and that tour, and when he was deep into his addiction was just kind of one of the craziest parts of that saga.
At the end of each episode, we each recommend something we like. It could be anything we want. Do you have anything you'd like to recommend quickly, David?
Yeah, I would recommend the new Charlie XX record, Music, Fashion, Film. Yeah, I've been a fan of hers on and off for years, and I think this is a very sort of cool pop rock record. I know pop rock is such a trite phrase to use for her, but it's one of those records that, much like Neil Young's Tonight's the Night. I remember when that album first came out, and I bought it when I was a teenager. I didn't know what the heck to make of it. It just sounded like the most out there record. It wasn't Heart of Gold. It was a little out of tune and scraggly, and everyone seemed a little stoned. And of course, back then,
kind of the point of that record, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't, back then, also, you didn't know the backstory, of these things. These records would just appear in the stores and be like, oh, it's a new Neil Young album. Why does he look so weird and disheveled on the cover? And then you're listening to it and the music sounds disheveled. But I kept listening to it. Like, I kept being pulled back into it, saying, I want to listen to that again. There's something going on here. I didn't know what it is. And every time I listened to it, it came together for me more. And it's one of my favorite records. And the Charlie record is like that a little bit. The first one I heard it, I thought, well, is this a rock record? Is this like kind of a scuzzy indie-ish kind of record? It has some pop melodies. And I've just kind of kept listening to it. And I think it's just a really kind of cool, alluring melding of all these things. It's not really rock and roll. It's not a sort of Taylor Swift kind of pop record either. It's this sort of kind of has a sort of subterranean rock clubby vibe to it, but with some pop elements mixed in, and not in a very contrived way. It just feels, I guess she's been listening to Velvet Underground, and I don't know if it doesn't sound like a Velvet Underground record, but it's as close as someone of that generation has gotten, I think, and it's something I've been listening to a lot.
Cool. I haven't heard that yet, so I will look that up.
Yeah.
We were just talking before we went on air. I'm going to quickly recommend the new Strokes album. I was talking to David about this. I kind of like it. I kind of played it, and it kind of caught me by surprise a little bit because there's a lot of slower kind of tunes with some interesting guitars, and it kind of wasn't quite what I expected. So I kind of liked it, but I don't think you quite like it so much, David.
I'm not crazy about the slower tunes. Yeah,
Right.
like my favorite songs.
I kind of like those.
Going,
I kind of was into
yeah,
that.
it's okay. It's cool.
I've been skipping the rockier tunes and playing the slower ones. So
okay. Yeah, well, that's fun. That's cool. Yeah, I kind of feel the opposite. I don't hate the Strokes album. I just, it hasn't really kicked in for me fully, even though I played it a whole bunch of times. And
25 years since is this it, as we mentioned?
25
earlier.
years, yes. It's kind of like the same period of time between the first Stones album and Steel Wheels, when you think about, I mean, and like the Strokes have done
recommend
6, 7
Steel
albums
Wheels
or
to anyone.
something, and the Stones did God knows how many.
Don't make anyone go and listen to Steel Wheels.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Keep that one to ourselves, I think.
No. I think Mixed Emotions is like the first AI Stones song. It was like a song. It was like, this is not bad, but it's not great either. It feels like a imitation Stones song.
Yeah,
Anyway.
one of my friends, Rupert, who comes to Arsenal games with us, he worked on that record, so he has some interesting stories about Keith Richards from that record. So yeah, it was.
Well, please have him on your podcast.
Yeah, we'll have to do that at some point. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you to David. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Loads of live events coming up in the autumn, as always. We've got Marco Perroni from Adam and the Ants, Dave Rowntree from Blur, Mickey Brenny from Lush. Lots more still to be announced. So keep an eye in the autumn